today we're talking to Craig Howard and Charles Yarborough, who are retired police officers who are bringing us policing from a black man's perspective. Now, gentlemen, welcome. We're going 10-8 now.
Hey, 10-8. We're
All
going
right,
10-8.
we're going in, y'all. We're about to go in. That's for those of you who may not know. That's code for clocking in over at the police precinct. So we just wanted to give it a little flair. So we're going 10-8 now. So a little bit about the history of policing in America. And we're going to retouch on that subject matter just a little bit. So, gentlemen, if you could just kind of catch us up a little bit. What policing? You know, we look at what police is today and all of that kind of stuff. So where did all of that actually start as a formalized thing in society?
Well, I think that what people have to realize and understand is it started back with the slave catching. As far as within the United States, policing didn't really start until like in the 1800s. But back then, in the early prior to that, it was marshals or, again, as I mentioned, slave catchers. So that was a part of the process in regards to how blacks looked at law enforcement, and not something that was comfortable, something that was helping you out. They were actually taking blacks and returning them back to their slave owners at that point in time. And then, of course, in the 1800s, with Bass Reeves being one of the first African Americans as far as the U.S. Marshal was concerned, and then law enforcement took over from there.
And as far as the history of policing in America, American policing was basically shadowing the police out of Great Britain, you know, and we adopted a lot of the traditions of policing in Great Britain when they started the formal police departments in the United States. Now, as Charles just mentioned, Bass Reeves is one of the first black U.S. Marshals. As a matter of fact, he was the first, but the first black police officers that we could locate that were brought into police service in the United States was over in Selma, Alabama, all the way back to 1867. And the first black female police officer was hired in Los Angeles back in, I think that would be 1916 or 1927. Mm-hmm. So
wow.
we've been in policing a long time, you know.
Yeah.
So, but as far as what Charles just touched on, the relationship between the black community around America, the African American community and police has been fraught from the get-go. And it goes back to the distrust we've had with the police because of the slave catchers. And, you know, just how the police, a lot of times when they began, they were not community policing.
No, exactly.
And when they came into community, it was always because of something bad. So that has a lot to do with the distrust that African American communities, it's almost in our DNA. The only time we would see them was when something was wrong.
Exactly.
So, you know, it's a whole lot of history there. And that's why I think we're seeing some of the things we're seeing in the United States now with the mistrust of the police in African American and minority communities.
Absolutely, and to piggyback on what Craig was saying, it goes back into some of the mistrust in regards to how confrontations with law enforcement and within the black community winds up somebody getting seriously injured or wind up getting killed. And that's been prevalent throughout the history of law enforcement as it relates to what happens within the black community.
Y'all brought up some really, really good stuff that a lot of people probably don't know or even care to know concerning the first black police officers, male and female, in this country. And you mentioned one thing that we should probably touch on is the relationship between the black community and police, in general, right? I've had situations where the police have been called to my neighborhood at certain times, and there's always a difference between how the black officers treated us and the white officers treated us. There have been good and bad in both situations, honestly, but in general, can you speak to that? What has been your experience there in terms of how you approach the community, a community full of people that look like you, versus how you've seen some of your fellow officers that may not be, that may be white officers or other ethnicities, how they treat the community? What have you seen in your experience there?
Can I touch on that?
Absolutely.
One of the things I found is if you grew up in the community, you know the culture of that community, you know the values of how people move in that community, and you can move around in there pretty good, even though you're a police officer, because you respect that community. And one of the things I noticed, and that's not just having been a police officer, if you've never been around a group of people and had an opportunity to sit down and talk to them or interact with them, let's be honest, people bring biases into any job that they do. And the police department is just a microcosm of the community. You have everything on the police department that you got on any job or any corporation, and people bring these attitudes in. If what I've seen is a police officer that's never worked around minorities, when I say minorities, are Black or Latino, and the only thing you know about the community is what you've seen on the news or what somebody told you or what was taught to you at the police academy.
Right.
Unless you're open-minded, you're going to bring prejudices that you have to the way you deal with people. I'll give you an example, and Charles and I have talked about this before. We get a call for guys standing on the corner drinking beer in front of a location. We respond. And what we know is when we pull up, these guys, it's a Friday, these guys have worked hard all week. They're standing in their yard or in front of their house, and they're drinking their local beverages that they like. First thing I know is when I approach them, I'm like, hey man, how y'all doing? I got a call about y'all out here drinking. Can y'all do me a favor? Can y'all put that beer in a cup with a bag and keep the noise down a little bit, because the lady down the street called and she's a little bit concerned. Oh, I appreciate that. A lot of times, an officer who's not able to go into a community and talk to people, first thing they want to do is jump out the car, put them on the wall, start frisking them, this, that, and the other, give me your identification. Now, those same guys that I showed a motive of respect to may be the same people when a crime happens in that neighborhood that will talk to me because I've got a relationship with me, that I've developed some trust with them.
Exactly.
I didn't disrespect them, and I handled them with respect as men. They appreciate that. Okay, we'll pour it in a cup, and from that point on, I won't have any problem on that block, and I'll get to know them. But if you come into a community and the people that you come in contact with, people sense when you don't like them. It's like this: when you go in someone's house, their house might not be kept clean like yours, but that's their house. You still respect it. You know what I mean? And people can read you just like we read them.
Exactly.
So it's a give and take. And one of the things I found is being a police officer, you pretty much have to be a chameleon in any neighborhood you go in.
Absolutely.
Remember Eddie Murphy, when he walked up in the bar, said he was a black Russian? So, that's how we survive in the street.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. And one of the things about that, and that's very important, is that it starts at the police academy. You have to have people that have that experience, have been out in the street, whether they be Black or white. I had some white officers that I know that have been into the Black community and have no problems
That's
whatsoever.
correct.
None whatsoever. Latino, female, so it's not the person, it's what they're being taught and the education that they're bringing to the table. Because if you bring in the right education and you're doing the right things at the police academy in regards to training, it helps to facilitate that, as well as having the community be involved in it. So the more that the community is involved in it, they come into the academy and they're talking to the young police officers, or IA1, they also can be instructors to help out with understanding the importance of how we can work together in order to deal with certain things that may happen within the neighborhoods as well as within the community, and other resources that we may also have to be able to bring these things together. And that's one of the things right now that hopefully that a lot of law enforcement agencies will start doing more and more of, and getting involved with the community and understanding the importance of how we can always work together, because a lot of the young people that are coming in now don't have that experience. They don't have that type of working with the neighborhood in regards to being able to talk to someone and come into some way where we can feel that trust and, hey, I respect what you're doing. Can you respect what I asked you to do? And let's move on and be peaceful.
Wow, you guys again brought up some great stuff. Training is a big thing that I want to circle back around to. We'll probably end off on the training tip, because I think that is something that kind of deserves its own voice, if you will, in terms of what you guys have experienced. But so back historically, speak a little bit more about historically how that relationship evolved with policing in Black communities. Of course, there was a time, and I think it may have been a brief time, where the majority of officers in Black neighborhoods were Black.
That's correct.
There was a time when that happened. What do you think switched that, and when that actually switched to where there are other officers white officers, namely coming into black communities, like you said, that don't understand the community, don't understand our culture, that kind of thing. When did you see that shift? And when that shift happened, what kind of things did you see will fall out from that?
Can I hit on that?
Absolutely.
I think when we really saw the problems in the African American communities around the country, or minority communities with the police, we go back to the 50s and 60s. There was always a problem with the way police officers treated people in our communities. It's just been historically documented. We can go back to Birmingham in the 1950s with Bull Connor.
Exactly.
And the Birmingham police turning water hoses, the fire
dogs.
department on dogs. We can go to the Watts riots in 1965. If you talk to anybody who grew up in LA in the 60s, they looked at the LAPD as an invading force in the community. We can go to Philadelphia with Rizzo and the way the police officers treated people there. We can go to New York, Prince George's County. So it's been all across the board, anywhere in America. I don't care where you go, it was a bad relationship. I think when we started seeing the police departments around the country trying to have any type of connection with the police was in the 1980s. I think around the time President Clinton came in and they started this whole thing about community policing.
Right.
And that was when the push, where it was that the police officers were being trained, hey, look, we've got to have a relationship with the community. We have to know these people, not just when we get a call for service, but, go in the neighborhood when on a day when you don't have a call for service and get to know people. So I think in the 1980s, when there was federal funding for these community policing, I have a retired buddy who was one of the first community police officers in Detroit. And he talked about, how they started that. So community policing was the first turn, I think, 180-degree turn that you saw, where police departments finally, after looking at all the riots and stuff that happened across the United States and the distrust with the police, that you saw any type of push by police departments to try to build relationships with their communities.
Right. And one of the things along with that is that when we started now having law enforcement officers in the schools, the school resource officers, that was one of the other ways of helping to build that relationship within the schools. The police officer would go to the school. Officer friendly program, and DARE programs.
Right.
So those
Drug awareness,
resistance
education.
Exactly. Yeah. So those are some of the programs that help to build that relationship. And then of course, back in the day when I came on, and Craig can also attest to this, is that we walked foot beats. And the foot beats were to see the police officer and be able to communicate with him or her that's walking that beat. And on your beat, well, Mr. Johnson lives over there, or Mr. Craig lives over here, or Mr. Todd lives over here. And we got a relationship with each other. We would wave, speak to each other. Sometimes they would even feed you or invite you over for dinner and things of that nature. So there was a community-based operation that we had within the community to help us all to get along much, much better.
And I think the change came in the 90s when we saw some terrorist attacks in this country. You saw what happened in Los Angeles with the two guys walking down the street with the body armor on, that the police had to break into gun stores because they were outgunned. And that's when you saw, I think, the police department start loading up on more weapons, to defend themselves. But, historically, I know in my family, there were a couple of police officers, but in most African-American families, we didn't trust the police because, like I said, the only time we saw the police in the community was when something bad happened. They'd come in, snatch somebody up, and then they would be gone.
Right. Do you think that, you mentioned the 80s and the 90s, and I just growing up, child of the 80s, I grew up on MTV, this kind of stuff. Right. Then gangster rap came, Did you see, does that kind of parallel those changes that you've seen? Does that parallel the gang, the glorification, if you will, in the media of gang activity and, NWA
I was going to say
all of those things?
So left the police.
Okay.
Yeah. So that really put it out there. And I remember I was working one day when the first time I heard that song, and everybody in the park in Atlanta, people in the park started singing at us, "Fuck the police." You know what I mean? And that, I was like, whoa, So yeah, I think that with the whole change in the music, the gangster rap, you're right. MTV, BET, you know what I mean? And that sent a shockwave through. when they made the movie, I know all the police officers I work with got mad when they made the I think it was Ice T. Made
Colors.
yeah. And then we had to tell the white guys in the roll call, hey, well, you ain't said nothing about Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was shooting 100 police officers, you know, in his movies. So, you know, what's it, the Terminator. So, you know, and believe it or not, as police officers, we would have discussions with other police officers about things that we saw in the community and we disagreed with. Prime example, Rodney King. We sitting in roll call, watching that on the news, and some guys who had been hired in the late 60s and 70s that were toward the end of their career, they sitting in there in roll call saying, oh, he got what he deserved, and we looking at them like, y'all crazy. Somebody should have put some handcuffs on that guy, got him up out the street. Right. But that's the way they policed. Coming from Vietnam and this, that, and the other, and we coming out, a lot of us, you know, new in policing in 1992, we thought that was absurd, which it really was.
Exactly. So it had a lot to do with how we interacted with each other, even not only just so much in the community, but inside our own department.
Yeah, I was
and dealing with those type of situations, because you had some people, and though there were some black and white officers, and male and female, but they had different backgrounds in regards to how they treated each other and how they came into the black neighborhood. And as black police officers, there were times where that we had to stand up and say, no, that's not acceptable. Right. That's not going to happen on my watch while we're doing that. And a lot of times I don't think the black community gives us enough credit. Not we asking people to pat us on the back, but there were times we stood up against certain things in regards to, and if you look around at most of the incidents that have happened where black police officers have been involved in certain situations, they're not necessarily against other people of ethnic groups. But if you look at 90% of the time when it's a white officer, it's 9 of the time it's against a black or a person of color, and you don't see black police officers around at all. All right? So normally these are the type of things that happen. So again, that goes back to that conflict, and hopefully to try to work into getting some type of way to change that, but it goes back to training in regards to recruiting as well. 3 of the things that we talked about: recruiting, training, and discipline. All those things in most major law enforcement agencies have to change and do a lot better in doing.
And I'm not going to take up and say, but the situation that happened in Memphis with those police officers that beat that young man up there at the cost, they were all black.
Exactly.
College educated, you know, in fraternities. Right. And for them to go out and do what they did in their community to that young man, to me, that was, I mean, I'm right, that was worse than somebody else. To me, their oath of office, they threw it in the trash. They were a gang walking around in police uniform. And I hope they get convicted and go to jail.
And I concur with that as well. And think about this, you know, when we hear all this stuff about Black Lives Matter, well, where was Black Lives Matter when? See? So you got black police officers that assaulted a black man, you seriously injured and got killed.
Oh, they murdered him.
They murdered him, yeah, exactly. So because of that, where was Black Lives Matter then? You know, where were the riots then? So when we look at these things, it shouldn't matter whether they're black or white. If law enforcement does something they're not supposed to do, they outside of the boundaries of their policies and procedures, definitely the community has to rise up against that, but also the law enforcement agency just as well. Swift discipline. You cannot violate these policies. You cannot violate people's rights regardless of what color they are, what neighborhood they come in. And these are the things that we stand up against.
Wow. Yeah, that situation that happened in Memphis was, it was different from what we normally see on the news in terms of it being a group of, I think it was 5 black officers.
Might have been more than that. Yeah.
That
it was
just
more than that, but it was
savagely
5.
beat a guy, you know.
Right, it was 5 of them actually at that scene once they cornered him and basically cornered him like you do an animal. And they gave him a beat down and they killed him. Wow. And I agree with Craig. They definitely, you know, they violated their oath. They definitely should go to jail. But again, I resort back to what I said earlier, and Craig and I both can agree. Where was Black Lives Matter then? Where were the riots then? When were people up in arms about that? And how many people within the black community said, hey, we're not going to tolerate this? But these are the type of things that we talk about. It shouldn't matter what color they are. The bottom line is you cannot violate people's rights, and law enforcement agencies now have to make these changes: recruiting, training, and discipline.
Right, recruiting, training, discipline. So that kind of segues us into another aspect of the conversation. You know, I want to talk more about training. So You mentioned that in the 80s there was the sort of officer-friendly situation where monies were actually being poured into police departments to train on the relationship aspect of policing, the relationship to the community versus just policing. So the first question I want to ask in that regard is, how much of policing, of good policing, good, fair, honest policing that benefits the community, how much of that comes from training?
I would say 100%, all of it.
All of it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree.
When I was a district commander, and I would have a group of young officers assigned out of the police academy to my district. We would bring them in a day or two before they would report to work for their assignments, and we would have community members there to meet them that were heads of members of different communities that were on boards, to come in and meet them and say, hey, these are the people you're going to be working with, and you need to know who they are, and to let them know that a lot of times they used to teach in the police academy, you're going to hit those streets, and you're going to have to be. A lot of the training I thought was back in the 80s, and was a warrior mentality. You're going to go out there in the street and have to. So a lot of you guys came out the academy thinking everybody they came in contact with was going to be a adversarial relation, and that wasn't the fact.
That wasn't the fact.
So then you had to reprogram to understand, no, we're there to serve and protect, but we are trained that if we have to escalate the force, on the theory of the force of escalation, that you're trained to do that. But our job is, when you look at it, it really says peace officers.
Exactly. And that's another term that people don't hear that much about, is peace officers. We come in peace. However, there are times when everybody may not necessarily comply or agree with what law enforcement is doing. And hopefully we can come to some happy medium where we can still do our jobs and enforce the laws that are within our purview, but also work with the community to get an understanding and the importance of how we can resolve the situation and use the minimum amount of force, whether it's verbal force or physical force. But that goes back to what Craig was saying, goes back to training. When I came on with my department in DC, similar to what Craig was talking about, but once you leave the academy, you go out to the streets and it's a different ball game. It's real world out there. So real world, there are times when you can walk up to a scene and you get that ultimate respect, but now things have changed so much in the community now, where law enforcement officers walk up to a scene, it's automatic conflict. Everybody's got a phone out, everybody's videotaping everything. So all this now is something where law enforcement now has to really put on different hats and try to come to some way of training these young people to be able to go out here and deal with this chaos. And a lot of times it doesn't always work out that way. And unfortunately, as a result of that, you have law enforcement officers violating their badge, violating people's rights and so forth. And it all comes back as a broad brush in reference to law enforcement not doing their jobs. And unfortunately, the reality of it is that we are doing a good job out there. However, there are times when things definitely do not go right and needs to be addressed. And the way they address it is recruiting, training, and discipline.
So it sounds to me, just based on what you said, recruitment is almost just as important as training.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Because I can just see how someone could come from a certain type of family or a certain type of ideology, so forth and so on, and then actually get into the police department and, like you mentioned before, Craig, bring a certain mentality in with them. Then the training is kind of layered over that. You know what I mean? They haven't necessarily changed their mind,
Right.
but they have training now that kind of supplements or goes with that. You know what I mean? And then the discipline part of that, which is what we'll get into. But that's a good triumvirate to deal with the recruiting, the training, and the discipline. So in terms of training, again, like the recruitment aspect of that. So when a police officer is recruited and they come into the academy, how have you seen the training change over the past, let's say 10, 15, 20 years, as to how people are dealt with? And the reason I ask that, I'm gonna preface that by saying, just in the last, let's say 10 years, and it's gone beyond that, you've seen so many videos of an officer just opening up and just shooting somebody. Just no questions really. Just it's gun, boom, 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 and they shoot. Right. We've seen this time and time again. Is that a training issue? And if so, if you look at it as a training issue, being a seasoned officer yourself, what has happened in the course of training over that period of time that has allowed things to get to the point where officers are shooting before they even really ask any questions?
Can I hit on that first? I'm gonna defer to Charles on the training point because he worked in training. But I will say this. One of the things I saw that changed over my career, almost 30 years, that a lot of departments started having what they call a citizens police academy. And they would invite the community in to participate in some of the same courses that officers had to take. And one of the things, we even brought media representatives into my department, and we put them in some of the scenarios that officers had in our shoot, don't shoot simulators, where you're out on the street, you have to make a life and death decision, just like that. They even bring juries in to do that. And what I found is, when you have a training academy where you're inviting the community in to educate them on what you're training your officers on, they seem to be coming out of that academy with a better understanding of what the job is, even to the point before they graduate from the academy, they have to go out at least 2 to 3 nights on what we call a ride along with those officers to see exactly what's happening out there. A lot of people have a perception of what police do by what they see on police shows. And with all the distrust that you've seen in the United States about policing, almost every TV network has a police show on it that's getting high viewership.
That's true.
You know what I mean? So I would say the change has been a lot of police academies that are open their academies up, they're training up, inviting the community in to see exactly what's being taught, have them participate in the training with the officers. So it's a give and take, a dialogue. If it's something in our training that we're doing that the community can point out and say, you might want to reconsider that, then we can adjust that, to make the training better for the officers going out in the street. And I think one of the other things that's changed in the training and what is these body cameras. And you have to tell people, and you tell the public, and I tell police officers, you have no right to privacy in public. Everything you're doing now is going to be seen by somebody and scrutinized. You know what I mean? So that's been one of the big changes that I've seen in policing. But the community policing, inviting them in, and any good police department is going to have a portion of their training where the community is in, giving them input on what they're seeing. One of the things I saw in my community, in my police department in Prince George's County, a lot of the people came in and said, we don't like seeing these police officers on traffic stops or field investigations, putting these young boys on the street. And I totally agree with that.
Sitting them down on the
ground or laying them down in the street. People didn't like that. And for a lot of police officers, they didn't want to change that because they felt it was an officer safety issue. But you got to also remember, even a crook on the street that you just caught in the middle of a crime, he does have the right to have some dignity. You're not putting me down in the middle of the street when there's snow on the ground or it's raining. So that was one of the things the community brought up, that they wanted to see change in their training. And those are the type of things I've seen when you have an open dialogue with your community. And your police department is supposed to reflect the values of the community you serve.
And that's a good point. As a matter of fact, he just brought up a scene that I went to. I was a newly promoted sergeant and was up in the Georgetown area, and we had some officers that had stopped some young men. And when I pulled up, they had them all on the ground, it was snowing and so forth. So I went over to the officer quietly and said, hey, get everybody and have them stand up. And majority, matter of fact, all of the young men were black. That they didn't do anything. There was a lookout for a robbery suspect. They fit the description of the clothing, but it wasn't them. So when I pulled up, I said, hey, get them up off the street. Let's talk to them and find out what's going on, and then they were released. But for our department, and Craig made a very good point, is that we started bringing in civilian instructors to talk about what's going on in the neighborhoods and so forth, because each neighborhood has its own nuance. So we bring people in from the different neighborhoods to come in and have a conversation, even the business personnel. So when the officer came out on the street, he would say, okay, that's Mr. So-and-so store, and so forth, and stop by the stores. Going to the stores, hey, how y'all doing today? Hey, is everything okay? Yeah, sure. And then we leave out. But that community-based policing is something that starts at the police academy and it filters out into the street. And having the community as a part of it, I think, is one of the most important parts in regards to a law enforcement agency or any training facility that you have within the United States. And that is an important element in order to slowly but surely reconnect the neighborhood with the police department, as well as these young officers that are coming out now that are totally different than when we came out. Totally different. Social media, how they look at things differently, the things that they talk about, the things that they watch and so forth. And then don't forget now, they're young people growing up looking at TV as well. So when they come to the police academy, they already have a perception which is totally outside of the reality of what goes on out there in the streets for real. And everybody that you run into is not necessarily a criminal or has criminal intent, but there are times when you may have to deal with that, and how we go about dealing with those things and how the outcome comes out has a lot to do with how we train, how we communicate, and how we work together with each other.
Wow, good stuff, good stuff. And it is good to see that, that efforts are being made to get the community more involved in the process of policing it. And if you really think about it, it just makes sense to do that.
Absolutely.
Because how can you necessarily police somebody and you don't know them, you don't understand them? You're bound to get off on the wrong foot. Like, that just almost is inherent in the process if you don't take those measures to train officers better.
Todd, can I just add
Sure.
one other thing? One of the best books I had to read when I was going up the ranks was a big book that we had to read called Multicultural Policing. And it went into different communities and how police officers should know a little bit about the traditions or habits of a community. Prime example, one of the things it said in the book, when you go into a home of a Latino or Hispanic family, and you go in to talk to someone in that home, and if the father's not there, and if there are sons in that house, those sons, a lot of times in that household, are going to step up before the mother will. So you speak to those young men first because they're taking the role of their dad. One of the things it talked about when you're dealing with a family that may be Asian, and when I say, I mean Chinese, Japanese, Korean. In their culture, they don't show emotions publicly. The way in an African American family, you go on a homicide scene, a lot of times it's going to be somebody out there wailing.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of emotions are going to be seen. Where when I worked homicide and worked a couple of those cases, they don't show emotions publicly the way that we do. You know what I mean? They will internalize it to the point, if you didn't know what was going on, it almost looks like they don't really care what's happening, but they do, you know? So I thought that was one of the best books that I ever read. Like something as simple as, if you go into a family's home that is Japanese, you don't touch a Japanese kid on the crown of his head. That's an insult. Or you saw it with President Bush in a Muslim or Arab family. To show them the bottom of your feet is the equivalent of us shooting a bird. The 3-finger salute. Remember when the guy took his shoes off and threw his shoes at the president?
Right.
Yeah.
So in their culture, the bottom of showing the person the bottom of your feet, that's the lowest thing. So those are things that young police officers need to know and understand when they're out there dealing with who you're dealing with.
That's a very good point. And that's one of the things that, again, going back to how important it is to have more of the community involved and understanding that each segment of the community has a different concept or a different way of doing things and the nuances. So bringing that into the academy makes things a lot better, and that's why it's so important.
And your police department should reflect every one of those groups that I just named.
Right.
Latino, Asian, they should be on that police department. Because
Absolutely.
then they reflect the community that they serve.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And although that's something important, you're not always going to get that.
Right.
But at least bring that into the academy and making sure that everybody understands it. And that's why now in law enforcement, it's so quote unquote difficult for these young folks to really grasp that, because again, you have to have experienced people that have experienced that, they can bring it into the community. So if the law enforcement officers can, then you bring the community in to do so. And that's one of the biggest things that happens with all law enforcement facilities in regards to training. That's why that's so important.
For those of you who were able to listen today, we want to thank you for tuning in. We want to thank you for listening to the the experiences that these young men have shared with us. And we just want to invite you to tune in on a regular basis, because we're going to be talking about a lot more than just these particular issues that we touched on today. Any last words that you guys want to mention real quick before we get out of here?
No, I just think there's so much out there as far as the policing topic and public safety in America. We could go on for days and days and still miss things that are important to the public.
Right.
And from our perspective is that we're here to open up these discussions, and hopefully that not only the public listening, but law enforcement agencies are listening. These young people that want to be police officers that are listening and paying attention, because we don't know everything. But based on our experience in the years that we've been out, from starting as young police officers in our areas and where we currently are right now, and thank God we're retired, but we have something to give. We want to give back. We want people to understand the importance, how it is from a black police officer's perspective, that really doesn't get talked about enough. And I think that we have something to share, and we hope that people listen and give us some feedback as well. And we're looking forward to the next episode.
And I just want to close on that by saying, being a police officer, in my mind, still is a very honorable profession.
Absolutely.
And we need good young people out there, because if they don't come, who's going to protect our communities?
Exactly. Right. And that's a very important point that Craig made. It's a profession. It's not a 9 to 5. It's a profession, and we need to get back to understanding when it says profession, it's professionalism that goes with it, and there's an esprit de corps that goes with it. There's an understanding that goes with it, and I think now that has been left out, not talked about enough. Professional, being a professional, looking a professional, talking that way, how you dress, how you communicate with people. That is so important, and unfortunately, a lot of agencies now, that's been left out and not really focused upon enough.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for those last words. And folks, you can tune in and hear this on YouTube. There's YouTube channels being created. You can also pay attention to the number on your screen if you want to call in and ask a question, or if you want to offer an opinion, or if you are yourself a retired police officer or an active duty police officer and you just want to add to the conversation. We invite you to call the number that's on the screen and leave us a voicemail, and we'll get back in contact with you and potentially maybe bring you on as a guest on our show. You know, these gentlemen have a plethora of experience to share, and I know that it's going to be received well in the community. And quite frankly, nobody else is talking about this. Nobody else is talking about policing from a black man's perspective. And I think that the fact that they're doing this just says so much about these gentlemen's heart and their mind and how they care for their community. So tune in, catch us on YouTube. There's going to be a website coming soon. We got a lot of things in the making, but we just had to start the conversation somewhere, y'all. So thanks again for joining us. Policing from a black man's perspective. We're going 10-8. 10-7, sorry. My bad. We're going 10-7, so that means we're off the clock. Until next